Okay, I want to welcome everybody tonight as we continue our study in the book of Acts. And tonight we're going to cover chapter 23, which means counting tonight, we only have 6 more chapters to cover in Acts. And I think we'll be able to cover a chapter each time we meet because they're pretty straightforward. Some of y'all are doubting, but that's okay. We'll see. We've done it the last few weeks, and I'm pretty sure we'll do it tonight. Matter of fact, it's possible we could get done earlier than usual. But after we get done with Acts, we're going to jump into the book of Exodus. So we're going to jump into the Old Testament. There's a lot of good stuff to work through in the book of Exodus. And so if you want to go ahead and start kind of reading up in advance, I'm looking forward to jumping back into the Old Testament. But to catch everybody up to where we are, since we didn't have this study last week, if we go back to chapter 21, we can track Paul as he, let me pull up the right map here, as he leaves Miletus, after he gives his farewell to the elders at the churches at Ephesus, and sails on his way to Jerusalem. Now we know, based on what he said to the elders there in Ephesus, that he would never see them again, so he kind of knows what's coming, what's ahead. And he has set his face to go to Jerusalem just like Christ did, knowing that there was going to be suffering that would take place. And Paul wasn't the only one that knew that. As we seen when he got to Tyre, the local disciples there, when they found them and met them, they also knew by the Holy Spirit that trouble was awaiting Paul when he got to Jerusalem. And they even tried to encourage him not to go. And we believe that was a test for Paul, because we know that Paul knew he was supposed to go there and ultimately that he would suffer. And so he goes from Tyre to Caesarea, and at Caesarea you have the prophet Agabus reappear in the Acts narrative, who was there earlier. And he's a prophet from Jerusalem, and he did the illustrated binding of himself and said that's exactly what was going to happen to Paul when he got to Jerusalem. And in response to that, again, Paul and Paul's company tried to encourage him not to go, but he knew that he was supposed to go. And if all of that wasn't enough, all of that drama, right? When he gets to Jerusalem, what happens? He greets the local church, which is the mother church, and they are questioning what he's teaching. And so for him to prove himself, after all of the work he's done for the kingdom of God, he chooses to do so. And he complies to paying the sacrifice for those who were going to consummate their Nazirite vows in the temple. And even agreeing to that, when he goes to the temple to do this vow that was really unnecessary, that he was bending over backwards to do just to keep peace and a working relationship with the Jerusalem church. When he's in the temple, what happens? If we're looking at the map here, he's inside the courtyard of the temple here. And he is dragged outside into this area right here, which is the court of the Gentiles. And this crazy mob is trying to beat Paul to death because they have falsely accused him of various things. And while they're in the midst of beating him, if you look across the courtyard of the Gentiles, you can see this fortress here, which is the Antonia Fortress. And there would be stationed Roman soldiers and the chief captain of the cohort. And he's seen the riot, which was a concern for him because on his watch, he didn't want a big riot. He didn't want a big ruckus. because he wanted to maintain peace and stability so that, he had an easy job. And so he intervenes and he steps in. And in the midst of this, they carry Paul, let's see if we can zone in here, up the stairs. And as they're going up the stairs, Paul speaks to the chief captain in pretty polished Greek, which catches him by surprise, right? Remember what the chief captain thought? And it's likely based on one of the accusations that would have been shouted, that he was the Egyptian who a few years prior had caused a big following and a big ruckus and had escaped whenever they were commanded to be pursued and killed on the Mount of Olives. And so he allows Paul from the top of these steps before they go into the fortress to address this wild, crazy, angry mob. You can read about that in chapter 22. And so he does. And he basically tells them about how he was one of them, doing the very thing that they are now doing to him. And how he had an encounter with the risen Christ and how that radically changed his life. And he talked about going to Ananias and receiving his sight. And then he goes into the Lord explaining to him while he's in Jerusalem for that brief stay, that 2-week visit that he mentions in Galatians, that they're not going to listen to you. They're not going to hear you in Jerusalem. So leave. And then he goes on to expound how the Lord revealed to him that he was to go to the Gentiles. And as soon as he said that, the crowd that had been listening goes crazy. Now remember, Paul spoke to them in Aramaic. And so the chief captain would have caught little bits and pieces of familiar words that he would have heard being around the temple courtyard. But he would not have understood the whole conversation. And if you've learned languages, you understand very clearly why that would be. And so, based on the crowd going crazy again and wanting to kill Paul, his logical explanation for this is Paul's fault. And so what does he do? He commands the centurions to take Paul and torture him. A process of beating that would torture him to basically get him to ante up and say what trouble he has caused that has caused this riot. But when they have him stretched out and they're fixing to beat him, Paul pulls out his trump card. And he says it very subtly. He says, do you think it's a good idea, and this is my translation, do you think it's a good idea to beat a Roman citizen before he has been civilly charged and found guilty before a proper court hearing? Which would have quickly grabbed the attention of the chief captain, because it was against Roman law to prosecute or to even treat as they had treated Paul without a proper hearing, trial, and declaration of guilt. And so that's where we ended. Paul has told them about his Roman citizenship, and they're in backpedaling mode, right? They're like, uh-oh, we've already crossed some lines that we don't need to cross, so we're going to have to handle him very carefully. And at the same time, we're going to have to keep the crowd somewhat pacified. So we see that he's in the same kind of dilemma that we see at the end of the Gospels, right? Where Pilate is trying to appease the crowd and they won't have it. And so he's in that same dilemma. And so we're going to pick up in verse 30 of chapter 22. And he says, on the morrow, or the next day, because he would have known the certainty whereof he was accused of the Jews, he loosed him from his bands and commanded the chief priest and all their council to appear, and brought Paul down and set him before them. And so the chief captain, essentially, he just wants to get to the bottom of this. He wants to find out what is the accusation that has caused such a ruckus and a riot against Paul. And so he calls the chief priest and the council, this would be the Sanhedrin, to appear together with Paul, and that brings us to chapter 23, which says, "And Paul, earnestly beholding the council, the Sanhedrin, said, Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God unto this day." And when he says that, verse 2 says, "And the high priest Ananias," and this is not to be confused with the one with a similar name that we see in the Gospels. There have been several high priests since the Gospels. Okay? But this high priest Ananias commanded them that stood by him to smite him on the mouth, because of the first statement that he makes. And watch what Paul says in response. And this is kind of controversial how we need to understand this, and obviously we're missing part of the story, but we can kind of talk about some of the proposals that's going on here. But verse 3, "Then Paul said unto him," and him being the high priest, "God shall smite you, you whited wall," or whitewashed wall, which is plaster that they would put on walls to cover it up and kind of make the appearance be nice, right? Which is a euphemism for hypocrisy, clearly. Jesus himself used a similar accusation against the Pharisees in Matthew 23. He called them whitewashed tombs, right? And the reason why he made that statement is he said, you go and you plaster these tombs and you beautify these tombs, but at the end of the day, they're still tombs that are full of dead men's bones, which in Judaism represents death and decay, right? And so it is pointing to hypocrisy in that lying beneath the facade, the appearance of beauty, is very much a problem. And that's exactly the same intent that Paul has when he makes this statement in response to the high priest. So, and he goes on and says, "For you sit to judge me after the law, and you command me to be smitten contrary to the law." And so basically he calls his hand on the fact that he has basically called for Paul to be smacked in the mouth, when there's no justifiable reason for him to even ask for such a thing. Because in the law it says that you are to hear them out before there is any type of recompense given for injustice or wrongdoing. And clearly he says one sentence and he's calling for him to be smacked in the mouth. And so verse 4, "And they that stood by said, Revilest thou God's high priest?" And this is where it gets interesting. Here in verse 5. "Then said Paul, I did not know, brethren, that he was the high priest." And he quotes from the law, "For it is written, You shall not speak evil of the ruler of your people." And so in light of the response, there are two different ways that we can understand Paul's response. Because clearly, when you understand the nature of the high priest and that he would have had peculiar garments that he would have worn that would have clearly shown that he is the high priest, even though he wouldn't have wore the high priestly garments that he would have wore in temple service, because this is not temple service, he would have still been able to be distinguished. And so to say that Paul didn't know that he was the high priest when he makes the statement is stretching it pretty good. Because Paul, even though he may not have known the high priest, because he has been away from Jerusalem for a long time, he would have known by his position in the assembly and by his attire that would have set him apart. And the fact that he called for him to be smitten. Who else would call for such an action to be taken against Paul. So we have that. One possibility, and this is probably the possibility that I would lean towards right now. Again, I feel like we have an incomplete story here. Is that he was being sarcastic. Because he has clearly said, essentially, in a roundabout way, you're unqualified to be the ruler of God's people because you just asked for something to be done contrary to the law that you should be most aware of. Are you following? And so I think Paul is sarcastically saying, I didn't know there was a high priest anymore. Because if you look at Pauline theology and New Testament theology and the words of Jesus, most importantly, there is no longer a God-recognized high priest or priesthood. As the book of Hebrews said, Jesus played the role of the sacrifice and the high priest, and that the authority was going to be taken from the priesthood and given to his disciples, his apostles that he had chosen. And the temple would be destroyed, and the temple would be replaced not with a structure built by human hands, but by people who would come to saving faith and trusting and following Jesus as the Messiah and the Lord. And so I think that Paul is being sarcastic in basically saying, you're not the high priest, and your actions clearly demonstrate that you're not. And the reason why that God has taken the priesthood from the corrupt leaders in Israel. And now you have to understand that with the Roman Empire, they did the appointing of who was the high priest anyway, so it wasn't done by the biblical succession that was put forth in the Torah based on the lineage of Aaron. And so there hasn't been a legitimate priesthood for a long time, even before Christ. So I think Paul is being sarcastic in what he says here and calling him out for his behavior. Because Paul says, you shall not speak evil of the ruler of your people. He obviously knew that the law says not to speak against the ruler of the people of Israel, but he spoke against him anyway, which tells us that Paul did not view him as the ruler of Israel. Okay? So that would be where I lean right now. Now you could say that he was still appointed by Rome. Rome was still the governing empire. There are plenty of New Testament passages that say that we are to submit to Caesar, that we are to submit to the king, with the exception that they do not ask us to do something that violates the law of Christ. So you could present that case, but again, when you look at the whole of what we read, I tend to believe that Paul was being a little bit sarcastic here and failing to recognize him as high priest. Because again, it's just hard to see how he would not know, if we were to take him literally, that he was the high priest, when clearly Paul, of all people, was very familiar with the inner workings of the priesthood and the Sadducees and Pharisees, as we're going to see, because he's going to use his knowledge of the tension between the Sadducees and the Pharisees to pit them against one another. So Paul's being about halfway ornery here, as we'll see. Let's keep reading. Verse 6, but when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees, and the Sadducees is the Hebrew word Sadokim, which is taken from the root word Sadok, which means righteous. And so the Sadducees were Sadokim, which is righteous ones. I mean, you literally had a class, and this was the priestly class. All the priests came from the Sadducee group, who labeled themselves the righteous ones. Yes, they were very self-righteous, as Jesus points out during his tenure here on earth. And then you have the other group, which we're familiar with probably more so in the Gospels, which is the Pharisees, Perushim in Hebrew, which means set apart ones. So here you have two classes of aristocracy in Israel. You have the Sadukim, which is the righteous ones, and you have the set apart ones, right? And they're jockeying for power, and they're jockeying for office and position and power and influence in Israel for a long time up to this point. And Paul knows their points of disagreement. And it's amazing how they could be so divided except when they have a common foe that they feel is a greater threat than the other camp. We've seen that in the life of Christ. The Sadducees and the Pharisees did not get along at all. They had different beliefs. They had different values. And they were competition for one another. But they were able to come together when they needed to do away with Christ, and here as they need to do away with Paul. But Paul, knowing that there's Sadducees and Pharisees there, because he was a Pharisee himself, he uses that to his advantage. He cries out to the council and says, "Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee." So he comes from a family of a Pharisaic line. And we know that he has earlier said that he spent his formative years in Jerusalem learning the law under the feet of Gamaliel. Okay, very zealous for the law. And so he says, "Of the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am called in question." Why would he bring that up? Because he knows. He knows what will happen if he does. Watch this. Verse 7. "And when he had so said, there arose a dissension between the Pharisees and the Sadducees." So it takes the attention off of him. And it shows the nature of the accusing parties. And that's what Paul is trying to demonstrate before the authority, and the authority to see this, hoping that justice obviously will play out as it should, but doesn't always go that way, especially in the first century in a power struggle situation like this. But verse 7 says there was a dissension between the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the multitude was divided. So they just start carrying on in a big uproar, fussing and fighting over the resurrection. And Luke gives this explanation in verse 8. "For the Sadducees say there is no resurrection." Why would the Sadducees say there's no resurrection? Because the Sadducees only recognize the Torah as binding law or scripture, whereas the Pharisees accepted the law and the prophets, basically the rest of the New Testament. So you had the Sadducees who only took into consideration the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis through Deuteronomy. And only what was written in those books did they consider binding or authoritative. But the Pharisees, which would be closer in line to what we believe that the whole Old Testament carries the authority of divine inspiration from God, binding authority. And so, because there's really nothing in the Torah at all about the afterlife, the Sadducees had come to the conclusion that there was no afterlife. That when you died, your soul died with you. And there was no afterlife. But watch what else it says. Well, obviously, if you don't believe there's an afterlife, you don't believe there's a resurrection, right? That goes without saying. But it says, neither angel nor spirit. Now, that would be troubling if you've read the Torah. Because there's plenty of angelic appearances in the Torah. As much as anywhere, actually. And so, it can't mean that they did not believe in angelic beings. But looking at how it is said, neither angel nor spirit, what it means here is that they did not believe in the intermediary state from death to the resurrection. So in other words, what Luke's saying is they didn't believe in the resurrection, and they didn't believe in an intermediary state in between awaiting the resurrection, which we would view as, in the Old Testament, would view as disembodied spirits or souls who go into Sheol and await the resurrection, right? We see that in Samuel whenever Samuel is called up, right? And he's called an Elohim. The word Elohim, translated in the Greek Septuagint, was translated as angel many times. And so those were overlapping words, and so they would not have believed in an intermediary state. Remember when Peter was in prison and they were having the prayer meeting? And he's knocking on the door, and the slave girl comes and she doesn't let him in. She runs back and tells everybody, "Oh, Peter's at the door." And it says, no, they didn't believe her, supposing it was what? His angel. They believed that he was killed and that he was disembodied, and there was an appearance of his disembodied soul. Okay? And so the Sadducees didn't believe in any life. Once you die, you die. Which is ridiculous to worry about temple sacrifices and all that. If there is no afterlife, why are we messing with it? Why aren't we just living life and doing what we want to do? If there's no afterlife at all, if there's no judgment, if there's nothing, it's just senseless. But the Pharisees confess both, because they accept the whole of the Old Testament. Now, they would not have believed in the afterlife like we do as Christians, no doubt. But they did believe in an intermediary state, and they believed in a resurrection, at least a resurrection of the righteous. Now, we know, with the hindsight of looking into the New Testament, there's going to be a resurrection of the wicked and the righteous. But they didn't understand as much as we do about the resurrection. Obviously, Christ was a game changer in the area of what life is like hereafter, because prior to Christ, everyone who died went to Sheol, whether they were righteous or unrighteous. They were simply kept in separate places, awaiting Christ's death. Okay? Nobody went to heaven before Christ was raised from the dead, and they were raised with him. Matthew 27, verse 52. Okay, I don't want to get too far off, because we're going to try to get through this whole chapter, and time is passing. So, you have this division in verse 9, and there arose a great cry, and the scribes that were of the Pharisees' part arose and strove, saying, "We find no evil in this man." So he actually has some of the Pharisees that are going to take up with him and side with him. Because they say, and this is their logic, "But if a spirit or an angel hath spoken to him, let us not fight against God." So again, this shows that they believed in that, what they would have viewed this appearance of Christ that he has explained as an intermediary state. Perhaps this was a visitation from an angel or another entity. We can't rule that out, because we believe in the afterlife. However, the Sadducees would have been fighting mad at that proposal. So they said, "But if a spirit or an angel hath spoken to him, let us not fight against God." In verse 10, "And when there arose a great dissension, the chief captain, fearing lest Paul should have been pulled in pieces of them." These people are crazy, aren't they? Crazy people. Just drag him out of the temple and just beat him to death, or just try to press in this, what should be civil meeting and discussion, and just want to pull a guy in pieces for telling them the truth. Who'd have thought? And so he commanded the soldiers to go down and take him by force from among them, and to bring him into the castle. So it didn't go well. So the soldiers escort Paul into the castle. And watch what happens in verse 11. "In the night following, the Lord stood by him and said, 'Be of good cheer, Paul, for as you have testified of me in Jerusalem, so must you bear witness also at Rome.'" How many of you think that would have been like refreshing for Paul? Right? His own people aren't going to get to pull him limb by limb, right? Can you imagine what this experience would have been like? It would have been easy to cave to the pressure, right? Kind of backtrack on some of his teachings to save his life, or, but he doesn't. And every time he gets an opportunity to speak, he doesn't just go into outright defense of himself. He starts talking about the life-changing experience and encounter that he had with Christ that has caused him to be the way that he is. What a testimony that he, in such difficult times, would be busy about the kingdom more than anything. Verse 12, "And when it was day, certain of the Jews banded together and bound themselves under a curse or an oath, saying that they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. And they were more than 40 which had made this conspiracy." So you have 40 men who have sworn, "I'm not going to eat or drink anything until Paul is dead." It's pretty rough, isn't it? "And they came to the chief priest and elders and said, 'We have bound ourselves under a great curse or oath that we will eat nothing until we have slain Paul.' So they come to those who carry authority amongst Israel, right? The chief priest, high priest, and the elders. And they're organizing a plan, a strategy that they will need their help in to organize a meeting with Paul and the chief captain. And in the process of him being escorted from one place to the other, they are going to lie in wait to ambush Paul and kill him, as we'll see. You know what's amazingly interesting about that? It is certain that many of those 40 would die in the process of killing Paul, being under the care of Roman soldiers who are better armed than any of them would be. These men had such passionate hate and disdain for Paul and the gospel message, the truth of the Messiah that brings salvation, that they were willing to die to see to it that Paul was dead. That's what Paul speaks of as zeal, but not according to knowledge. And zeal, not according to knowledge, is blindness and ignorance and stupidity. But that's exactly what religion does. It blinds you and makes you do things that are unfathomable. And so, verse 15. "Now therefore, ye with the council signify to the chief captain that he bring him down unto you tomorrow, as though," watch the manipulation here and the strategizing, "as though you would inquire something more perfectly or completely concerning him." Now, what's he trying to get him to do? Lie to the chief captain and say, we'd just like to hear Paul speak a little bit more. Maybe there's just a misunderstanding or something. Why don't you bring him on down? And the 40 people who have bound themselves to an oath are waiting in a prime spot to ambush, risking their own lives so that Paul can be killed. As they say, and we, wherever he come near, are ready to kill him. Verse 16. And when Paul's sister's son, which would be his nephew, heard of their lying in wait, he went and entered the castle and told Paul. Which is the first mention that we have of Paul's family. But this also speaks of the fact that, like Paul said, that he was from a family of the Pharisaic tradition, that he's not the only one who was associated with Jerusalem or the Pharisaic training. Because here's his nephew in a position to overhear this plot and this plan, which makes us wonder, and we don't know, we can just assume, if he was still connected to the Pharisees somehow and caught wind of this in the midst of all this. I mean, how else would he hear of this plot to kill Paul? It wasn't like they were going around, announcing their big plan. Obviously, they would want to keep it quiet. But nonetheless, he finds out, and he's able to go to the castle and speak to Paul. Now, why would they let him in the castle to speak to Paul? Because the chief captain has committed some no-nos in how he's handled Paul so far. And so no doubt he would be very placating to Paul, because obviously Paul at some point could speak as a Roman citizen and a witness against even this chief captain. Okay? And so you can see why he would have allowed him to come in and visit him as a quote-unquote prisoner, because as a Roman citizen he could not be viewed as such until he was properly tried and convicted. And so, watch what Paul does. Verse 17, once he finds out from his nephew. Then Paul called one of the centurions unto him, it's one of the chief Roman soldiers, and said, Bring this young man unto the chief captain, for he hath a certain thing to tell him. Notice how Paul wants to keep this concealed from anyone else but the one person who has the authority. Pretty smart on his part. And so he took him, verse 18, and brought him to the chief captain and said, Paul, the prisoner, called me unto him and asked me to bring this young man to you, who hath something to say to you. Verse 19. Then the chief captain took him by the hand and went with him aside privately and asked him, What is it that you have to tell me? Verse 20 at the top. And he said, The Jews have agreed to desire thee that you would bring down Paul tomorrow into the council, the Sanhedrin, as though they would inquire something of him more perfectly. But do not yield unto them, for there lie in wait for him of them more than 40 men, which have bound themselves with an oath that they will neither eat or drink till they have killed him. And now are they ready, looking for a promise from you. So he explains what their plan is, what their intentions are. And verse 22 says, So the chief captain then let the young man depart and charged him, See, you tell no man what you have showed these things to me. Verse 23. And he called unto him 2 centurions, saying, Make ready 200 soldiers to go to Caesarea, and horsemen 70, and spearmen, which is an odd word here that's used in the Greek. It's a hypoxogomenon, which is a one-word occurrence in the New Testament. Matter of fact, it's really not even in Greek literature until around 600 AD, very commonly, which has puzzled scholars as to what exactly it means. It means one that puts their hand towards something. So the translators here assume that, okay, you got soldiers, you got cavalry. Maybe this is spearmen. But honestly, I'm not exactly sure what's being meant here. 200 of those, and at the third hour of the night, and provide them beast, that they may set Paul on. Notice that it says beast, that they may set Paul on. What's likely going on here? Why would he need more than one? Because they're going to travel a great distance, as we'll see. They're going to travel 35 minutes straight, and they're going to leave at night. And so, why would they take two for Paul? He would ride one part of the way, get off of it, and get on the other one the rest of the way, so that you don't have one beast carrying the full burden for, as we'll see, 35 miles as they will go in the first leg of the journey, which is pretty good distance to travel. Obviously, the chief captain senses that he's got to get Paul out of the city, or there's not going to be good things that happen for himself. I can assure you he's looking out for himself first and foremost. And so he calls all of this together, provide them beasts that they may set Paul on. Some have assumed here that there's more than one beast because Luke goes with them. That may be possible because we'll see that Luke does end up in Caesarea. But again, it doesn't say that. It says, provide them beasts that they may set Paul on and bring him safe to Felix, the governor, who's the governor or ruler of Judea, who ruled from about 52 to around 5960 A.D. And here the story is taking place in the latter part of 50s, 57, 58 A.D. He's very corrupt. I forgot to mention this, but the high priest that was ruling, who was in this scene earlier, is spoken of by Josephus, who was a first century historian, and he is spoken of very negatively, as is Felix. Very underhanded, very much in partnership with Rome, which is beautifully depicted in the book of Revelation when it talks about some of the apocalyptic imagery there, where you have religion cooperating with the world system hand in hand because they have the same values. They both have taken the mark of the beast. They love the world and not God. And very corrupt, very underhanded, very wicked and evil people who are out for themselves, out for power, and all the vain things of life. But he sends them to Felix the governor, and he wrote a letter after this manner. And here we have a letter that is actually written by the chief captain, and he's going to name himself, which begs the question, how in the world did Luke know how this letter read? We have two options. Obviously, we know that Luke stayed in contact with Paul throughout the rest of his life, even while he was in Rome. And also, he will appear in Caesarea, as we'll see. And so he very well may have heard it himself. We don't know that for sure. But worst case scenario, obviously Paul would have been able to tell him what the letter said. So here's the letter that was written by the chief captain. Claudius Lucius, unto the most excellent governor Felix, sends greeting. This man was taken of the Jews, and should have been killed of them. Then came I with an army and rescued him, having understood that he was a Roman. I don't remember it going like that. I don't remember the reason why you rescued him is because he was a Roman, and you knew that in advance. So what do we see here going on? Obviously he's lying, because that's not how it went. What is he trying to do? Cover his own tail and make himself look like he did the noble, upright thing to do as someone who's employed by Rome, or ultimately answers to Rome. And so, oh my God, so much corruption in this story. It's not even funny. Verse 28. And when I would have known the cause whereof they accused him, I brought him forth into their council. What about the part where you commanded him to be tortured? You mean that led to you finding out he was a Roman citizen? What about that part of the story? He conveniently left that part out, right? He's just, again, he's covering himself. And he says, when I would have known the cause whereof they accused him, I brought him forth to their council, or Sanhedrin, whom I perceived to be accused of questions of their law. But, and now watch what he does. He covers his butt with Paul. Watch this. This guy, it's easy to see why he was able to be in power. Because he's a placating genius. Watch what he says. And when I would have known the cause that they accused him, I brought him under the council, whom I perceived to be accused of questions of their law, but to have nothing laid to his charge, worthy of death or of bonds. This was not his attitude. Verse 30. And when it was told me how the Jews laid wait for the man, I sent straightway to you and gave commandment to his accusers also to say before thee what they had against him. Farewell. So again, we see that this chief captain is out for himself, and he's going to do whatever it takes to make sure he takes care of himself. And verse 31 says, Then the soldiers, as it was commanded them, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris, which is 35 miles. And on the morrow, the next day, they left the horsemen to go with him and return to the castle. So you have an escorting party of a large number of soldiers and cavalry. But at some point, when they get a good ways into the journey, which would be through the part of the journey where they were more at risk themselves for robbery along the way, very known to be a dangerous route that they travel. Again, they left at night. But when they get to this location, some of them go back, and the cavalry advance with Paul. Verse 33, who when they came to Caesarea and delivered the epistle or letter to the governor, presented Paul also before him. Again, this is Felix. And when the governor had read the letter, he asked of what province he was. And he would ask him that because, why? Because the letter had shared he was a Roman citizen. And so, naturally, he would want to know what province he was from. And when he understood that he was from Cilicia, I will hear thee, said he, when your accusers are also come. Who would his accusers be? Primarily the chief priest and that religious entourage. And he commanded him to be kept in Herod's judgment hall, the Praetorium. If you go to Caesarea, you can see the remains of the Praetorium today. So, for all of you doubters, it's 750. And we covered a whole chapter. So, any questions? Amber?
How come in verse 9 on the King James Version it says, let us not fight against God, but it does not say that piece in the NET?
You'd have a difference of manuscripts that they're drawing from, and they would feel like that was inserted by a scribe, which is usually the case when they choose to leave something out. And so again, they don't feel like it's part of the original, which is the position that the NET takes. Is if they feel like something was added by a scribe and not part of the original manuscript, which is what their effort is to produce what they feel like based on the evidence. Again, there are areas where we don't know, we just make an educated guess. They don't feel like it was part of the original manuscript.
It seems to change the meaning. It doesn't say, let us not fight against God. It seems like it doesn't have as much power to it, saying, well, we don't know if an angel is spoken to it.
Yeah, it seems more of a favorable response of the Pharisees towards Paul in the King James than it does the NET. And the possibility that maybe God did speak to him. So, yeah, it definitely does make a difference. So, the NET, they didn't think it should be there, so they didn't put it. Shane?
Is there any evidence when the Sadducees and Pharisees kind of split in this commotion? Is there any evidence that weighs into the 40 being Sadducees and that continually being his push against? Or is it just kind of left up to the reader to interpret?
Yeah, honestly, I wouldn't know. He obviously knew that it would cause debate, and it was a hot topic of debate and division, and
Yeah.
clearly it worked.
It just seems like that's the more adamantly opposed group in the reading.
Yeah, it's kind of odd because in the Gospels it appears like the Pharisees are more in opposition to Christ, because you have a lot of the scenes where he's being accused of violating the Torah. And what actually was happening is he was violating their interpretation of the Torah, because they valued the traditions, which was their faulty interpretations of the Torah, more than the whole counsel of God's Word. But the reason why the Sadducees would be so passionate and adamantly in opposition to the Christian movement is obviously the foundation of the Christian movement, which is the resurrection, which is one thing they were not willing to even entertain at all. And so, you pick on one of their cardinal doctrines, you have fighting mad religious people, and that's extremely, extremely dangerous.
And extremely confused people because they're following commandments that lead to nowhere for no supposed purpose, or
That is,
continues to baffle me.
yes. Like I said, if there's no afterlife, why are you sacrificing animals? To prolong your life here? I mean, it just is redundant. It's just goofy. It's what it is. But there's a lot of stuff people believe today that is the same. But people just believe what they've heard all their life, even if it isn't true. Any more questions?
Is there anything in any of the history books or anything that says how many of those 40 men or 40 plus men starved to death?
We do know that the high priest was killed in 66 AD by Jewish rioters, zealots, because he was a placater to Rome. He was a puppet, and he did a lot of horrible things, and they knew it. And so in the siege there in 66, they killed him. His own people killed him.
This same one.
Yes, Ananias. Yep.
Seems odd that they're okay with this plan to kill somebody when that's so obviously against what they say they believe in. Sure,
Yeah.
let's all get on board, and I'm gonna lie for you too while we're at it.
I've seen a lot of Christians do a lot of things that Christ wouldn't come near condoning, authorizing, or okaying. So, that which has been is that which shall be, and there is no new thing under the sun. Cain killed Abel. Cain hates Abel. Why does Cain hate Abel? Because Cain's deeds were wicked and Abel's were righteous. It just keeps repeating itself. History keeps repeating itself. It just modernizes what it looks like. Unfortunately. Any other questions? Let me check my phone here, because I don't want to get no hate mail. I ain't got nothing. So I don't want to get no text. Any more questions? Last chance. All right.